their futures. Soldiers speak out.
Welcome to the Veterans Hour, a monthly program produced by the Rachel Corrie Chapter 109 Veterans for Peace in Olympia, Washington. The Veterans Hour is brought to you monthly. Every month we bring a new program addressing veterans issues and veterans activities. I'm Mark Fleming, your host for this month's program. Veterans for Peace is a global organization of military veterans and allies whose collective efforts build a culture of peace by using our experience and lifting our voices. We inform the public of the true causes of war and the enormous cost of war, with an obligation to heal the wounds of war. The Rachel Corrie Chapter in Olympia is one of over 140 chapters worldwide whose work includes educating the public, advocating for dismantling of the war economy, providing services that assist veterans and victims of war, and most significantly, working to end all war. Each month we present a program focusing on veterans issues, and issues of war and peace. This month's topic addresses actions planned to create changes in America's energy policies. As veterans, we recognize that resource control and allocation has long been a major cause of conflict among nations and a continuing threat to peace. More recently, people around the world now recognize that these same issues threaten to change the Earth's climate in ways that are detrimental to life as we have known it. I'm very pleased to have as my guest tonight Graham Clumpner, who's an Afghanistan war veteran and works with GI Voice, who's working with the BreakFree organization. And tell us a little bit about BreakFree, Graham.
Well, thanks for having me, Mark. It's good to be here. I think we're at this really fantastic moment in time, and there's a lot of activity happening across social movements, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's folks targeting fossil fuel infrastructure around climate change, or anti-war work with the 7 wars that our country's currently in. And I think it's important to kind of understand and personalize how we all came to this point. For me personally, I joined the military after 9/11, and as a teenager growing up in the 1990s, I saw very little to plug into or to find purpose in. And when 9/11 happened, it was very clear-cut to me that this was something that affected all of us, that there was a world outside of Bellingham, Washington, and that there were people outside of the United States that their actions affect ours and our actions affect theirs. And my journey in the military led me through the Army, through basic airborne and Ranger indoctrination program to come out to what is now called Joint Base Lewis-McChord here in Washington State.
Back then it was Fort Lewis, no
Back
doubt.
then it was Fort Lewis, yes. They merged the air base and the Army base together to ostensibly save taxpayer money, but in a lot of ways it's actually made the base a more permanent fixture in this region. And one of the largest carbon emitters in Washington State. So my journey in the military, deploying to Afghanistan, and especially seeing the abuse not only of the populations that we were occupying, but even more so internally. Officers of enlisted personnel and those sergeants who were above us abusing people below. And it was an environment that wasn't what they said in the Army recruitment commercials. And it took a long time for me to turn it on my brain and to really understand how the way that we treat each other is the way that we treat the rest of the world.
And how long were you in?
I was in for 3.5 years. And I got out in 2007, and I immediately began struggling with what I know now was post-traumatic stress. That caused a lot of anxiety. I dealt with highs and lows of depression and could not really find a way to recreate some of the adrenaline-based activities that the U.S. military was putting me in. It's tough to come back to the United States after jumping out of airplanes and find something that brings you up to that level. And I crashed. I had a very difficult time adjusting. And I actually have to thank the U.S. Army for bringing me back, because in 2008, about 5 days after Barack Obama's election, on Veterans Day no less, my family received a letter from the U.S. Army. And that letter informed us that I was being recalled to active duty and that I was to deploy to Iraq for 1.5 years, 444 days to be exact. And I didn't know what to do.
This was after you were discharged?
This is a year and a half.
You were still in the reserves?
Yes, I was still in what's called the Individual
Yes.
Ready Reserve. It's what we like to call a backdoor draft. Instead of, when wars are unpopular and folks are not volunteering, the U.S. military goes and pulls civilians who were former soldiers back into the military. The press didn't cover it very much, and so it was done to tens of thousands of soldiers. So I stumbled into being a GI resistor. I didn't exactly know what to do, but I knew that I wasn't going to go back. And that led me down a rabbit's hole of learning that I may never have done had that not happened to me. In that process, I got involved with a number of GI resistance and anti-war groups, from Veterans to Peace to GI Voice and Iraq Veterans Against the War. Traveled around the country and was able to meet some amazing people that have been involved in social justice and revolutionary work for a lot longer than I've been alive. And on their shoulders, I've been able to learn a lot about how movements are successful and how movements fail. And even more importantly to that is my background in history, which I've done through my undergrad and graduate school, but just being raised by parents who were both teachers, understanding that history is very important. I started to learn a new history after the U.S. Army. And that history included stories that weren't just the generals, they weren't just the presidents, they weren't just white men who were dead. It was normal people, people that I could actually identify with and connect with. And those normal people throughout history, over and over and over again, especially in the United States, are people who built mass movements for collective change. Whether it's abolitionists, throwing off the chains of slavery, from all walks of life, rich and poor, religious and atheist, black and white, people who came together around one demand and achieved it. And then, every major fundamental shift in American society, whether it's integration or women's access to the vote and equal rights, whether it's opposition to the Vietnam War or anti-nuclear activities, or even now, like I mentioned earlier, Black Lives Matter, we're seeing over the last year has just exploded, and we're finally having a conversation about mass incarceration and police violence. So I came to understand history as not just this thing that you see a date on the wall and one person associated with it, but an ongoing story that I'm part of. And ultimately, this whole experience in the military and being associated with people who consider themselves to be professionals in what is called national security. I became very interested in the definitions of national security. So traditionally—
It tends to be kind of broad.
It is a very broad, and it depends on who's saying it, right? So national security traditionally is this idea of there are enemies of the United States and there's us here in the United States. And we are one homogenized group of people in America, and we all want the same thing. And we have to protect ourselves from those enemies. And after 9/11, we saw a lot of changes in the fundamental basic precepts of American society. And some of the groups of people that have always been protected, and I would put myself in that category as a white guy, some of the people that have benefited from the so-called American dream, even those people started to see some of the cracks in the American establishment and some of the lack of support and safety. And so we were given this view that you must sacrifice on some level your liberty for some safety. And I never was able to accept that. And the national security debate has broadened since 9/11. I mean, we've seen Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning release incredible amounts of information that have exposed how our intelligence services operate, how the U.S. military operates overseas, which was never a surprise to veterans. I mean, as a Vietnam veteran, clearly you know what the innards look like. But I think most Americans don't get access to the on-the-ground, day-to-day behavior that is normalized in those structures.
And up until now, it's always been, well, yeah, it happened, but it was very isolated. What Manning and Snowden did was show how widespread it is.
Right, it's systemic, and that's I mean, I think as Americans, we are constantly thinking about ourselves as individual actors. And this is important when it comes to war, and it's important when it comes to climate change to think about, it's actually about the structures themselves that are the problem. I'm not going to be able to end climate change and prevent disaster simply by screwing in a different light bulb, or by driving a Prius, or by riding my bike everywhere. There are global challenges, and those global challenges require global solutions. And that means people from all levels, not just the government. In fact, the governments are probably the least important in that analysis. So in 2007, when I was leaving the Army, a report began to circulate within the military. And at that time, I was like very interested in future threats. You know, okay, so we're in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're spiraling out of control in 2006, 2007. What does 10 years down the road look like? What is the US military saying about that? And I came across a draft document that is publicly available, and you'll get the link in the background here, that basically looked at the next 20 years. And according to the Department of Defense, under the Bush administration, the greatest threat to the next 20 years for the US military was climate change. And I'm sitting here like, well, what is climate change? Okay, so the weather's going to get bad, and that's going to make us all...
Back then, I think it was global warming.
Right, yes. And the language has changed over the years for various reasons. And so I kind of lodged that in the back of my mind. But I didn't really... It didn't take over the front page news of a suicide bombing in Baghdad or, you know, a gunman in Kabul or Kandahar. Until we began to see multiple reports, not just the federal government, not just the Department of Defense, but the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency. Then you started seeing these global reports, like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is basically a collection of thousands of scientists all over the world who do this work for free, who come together and provide independent analysis and data. And they work with governments, and they work with scientists, and they work with communities to try to analyze all of the possible data that we have. And their conclusions have rapidly been increasingly bad. Every 5 years we get a new report. We just got the last one in 2014. And it's telling us that we are in dire, dire straits. So I'm going to kind of lay out a little bit about what's happening in terms of climate change and then what the responses are right now, because I think a lot of the discussion that has happened in climate change has been this political discussion where you've got, at least in the United States, you've got two parties who believe fundamentally different things. The Democratic Party tends to give lip service to climate change and say we have to do something about it. Generally, their plans are not that feasible, but they're at least talking the talk.
At least recognize that we need to do something.
Exactly. And then you have the Republican Party, which is, there's no elected senator and very few elected representatives who acknowledge that climate change is real and caused by human events. So we've actually known, as a country, we've known that climate change is happening and is man-made since about 1977. There has been evidence prior to that, but what we do know is that one of the largest, if not currently the largest corporation on the planet, ExxonMobil, was doing its own research in the 1970s. Now, why would Exxon be doing research about climate change? Well, one of the areas that has a whole crap ton of fossil fuels in it that is not very accessible is the Arctic Circle. And the Arctic Circle at that time was covered by a lot more ice than it is now. And there were a lot of questions about what kind of destruction or damage could happen to Exxon's resources if they wanted to drill in the Arctic. They were asking themselves, if the Arctic is melted at certain times of the year, suddenly you'd have a trade route that was much quicker than going around South America or going through the Panama Canal. You could just go straight to Europe from Canada. And that fundamentally changes, cuts a third off of trade time, saves a crap ton of money. And so Exxon had all these really, really smart scientists. They hired the best. And internally, they looked at all these different things. And they came to the conclusion that CO2 going into the atmosphere was going to, and the oceans, was going to raise the temperature of the planet, and that it was already doing so. And they used calculations that had been started in 1958 in Hawaii on this place called Mauna Loa. There's an observatory that every year has measured the level of carbon in the atmosphere. It is the single most important scientific device on the planet. More important than our International Space Station, more important than going to Mars, more important than solving cancer. It tells us that there has been a rapidly increasing line every single year that correlates directly with industrial civilization. So as the 1830s happen, you suddenly see what was a rather stable plane start to go up. And every year, as more countries join in to utilizing fossil fuels, you see that increase. So as you add population, with population comes more consumption. As people are brought out of poverty, that increases the amount of consumption that they have, or that they do, which increases the amount of fossil fuels in the atmosphere. It's important to understand that there's a lot of unknowns about climate change. And I know that there's a debate, or so-called debate, out there about whether this year is colder than last year. We have to step back from this and understand that the people telling us, the people raising the alarm and screaming at the top of their lungs, the science community, is over 98% certain that this is happening and that this is man-made. They can point to specific examples, such as Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Sandy, where the storm surges or the amount of destruction coming on land from water that's pushed by these hurricanes is much more increased. The waters are warmer, which makes things spin more rapidly, which makes the storms bigger. So climate change is one of those problems that it's not so much one issue that's happening, it's a global issue that makes every other issue worse. So for example, here in the Pacific Northwest, we have oyster challenges now. Our ocean is acidifying, meaning the pH level is dropping, meaning that things with shells, whether they're clams or oysters or mussels, they have to calcify their shells when they're very young to be able to survive. They can't calcify like they used to. So it usually takes about 6 weeks, and they're unable to do that. So we have local community oyster farms now that are growing the larva in Hawaii or in Southern California, and then bringing it up here 6 weeks in to make it happen. Yeah, right. You've got massive, you had the mudslide 2 years ago. You've got massive droughts that are happening all over the United States. Washington just came out of almost a 2-year drought. Unheard of in the Pacific Northwest. This is the place where we have water.
Right.
So it's not that like the drought itself is going to kill you, but a drought coming into an economically challenged area, or a place where you have low income, or a place where you've already got other existing social challenges, it exacerbates everything. It makes it worse. So for me, what I've been looking at in graduate school is this combination of climate change and conflict. What happens when you have an already existing conflict zone, such as Syria, where there's existing tensions, there's social challenges, economic challenges, tribal and religious challenges, but you also have external forces like the United States military occupying Iraq for 9 years, and then refugees moving. So all of the refugees that we see in Europe, a lot of that is instigated by this worsening drought situation in the Middle East that's been going on for 30 years. And the defense industry, the military is telling us this. They're saying that this is going to produce mass migrations, that the concept of borders is going away. The groups like ISIS in Syria or Boko Haram in Nigeria are capitalizing on climate change.
And this was the gist of that report you were talking about the Pentagon did?
Well, the Pentagon's report was a theoretical 20-year, this is what's happening. And since then, there have been what's called the quadrennial defense reviews. And the quadrennial defense reviews happen every 4 years, and they look at like what the greatest threats are. Consistently since 2007, these QDRs, as they're known, have pointed out climate change very specifically in areas of the world that are causing conflict and that the U.S. is going to have to respond to. So a lot of my work has been asking the question of what kind of role does the United States military play in a world where there's mass migration, you already have all these existing tensions, and you have what was formerly known as the global war on terror, which is now just known as drone strikes and special operations raids.
The forever war.
The forever war, yeah. So what does the forever war look like in a world that's ravaged by climate shift? And it's a very, very scary world. So I encourage folks to check out, it's not that difficult to find peer-reviewed, cited material from some of the best experts. I mean, if you get on an airplane and you trust that the science behind the airplane is going to get you from Seattle to New York, then you should be trusting these same scientists to tell you that the atmosphere and the oceans are warming to a dangerous point where human beings can't exist.
And I think part of the debate is they say, you know, the deniers say, well, science hasn't proved it. Well, you got 2 scientists here that say there's some questions. You got 98 others who have no question.
Right. Well, see, that's the interesting thing about science. Gravity is not proven. Gravity is something that up until now we've consistently gotten the same result. When we drop a ball off the roof, it hits the ground. Now, there are some variables. If you have, say, a wind machine at the bottom of the building, then the ball may not hit the ground. It may fall down to the wind machine and blow back up. But you're manipulating gravity when you do that. So if you follow the basic rules and laws of gravity, you're going to get the same result each time. Now, is there a scenario where gravity suddenly proved to not be what we thought it was? Yes. But until then, we govern and plan our entire lives based on the assumption, the trust, that gravity will continue to behave the way it does. The climate system is much more complex, but it's still measurable and understandable. And climate is essentially like a large gathering of weather. Weather is a 10-day framework. Climate is a gathering of multiple 10-day frameworks over hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. And we can look back through time, and we can tell some very specific things, such as human beings, as we have thrived for the last 11, 12,000 years, as we ceased to be hunter-gatherers and became more settled and used agriculture and built cities, that period of time, the last 11,000 years, has been an amazing blip in climate history. It's been this perfect Goldilocks era, and that corresponds to human civilization. Hominids were around long before 11,000 years ago, but they weren't settling and building cities and building what we call civilization. Now, we can have a whole discussion about whether or not civilization is a good thing, but I think, given that everyone is watching this on some sort of technology produced by civilization, I'm going to assume that we can blow past that for right now. So we do know that the level of carbon in the atmosphere determines a whole bunch about whether or not life can live on this planet. So in the Permian extinction, which wiped out almost 95% of all life on the planet, there's been 4 extinctions before, so 5 extinctions before this. I forgot that one, a couple billion years ago. In the Permian, the water in the oceans boiled. I mean, it boiled, it killed off everything. And the level of CO2 in the atmosphere was upwards of 600 parts per million.
Now, was that the one that killed off the dinosaurs?
This is before the dinosaurs.
Okay.
This is right before the
So
dinosaurs.
what caused the water to boil?
Well, we don't know. I mean, we weren't there. But what we do know is we know the level of carbon in the oceans and the atmosphere, and we know that there's some sort of balance.
So carbon dropped drastically during that time.
So yeah, so there's a lot of theories about this. There was mass die-offs. Carbon is in us. If I die, I'm going to emit carbon. Trees hold carbon, plants hold carbon, soil holds carbon, oceans can hold carbon, but it can also release it. And so there's this constant balance and fluctuation going on between where carbon is stored from like the center of the earth all the way up to the atmosphere. And when that balance is out of whack, it doesn't work well for us as human beings. So science is telling us that the safest level of carbon in the atmosphere that we can have a civilization with is about 350 parts per million. We are currently around 405 parts per million. It's really important to understand there is a massive lag time. So when you turn the tap on your bathtub and the water's flowing, you turn on the hot water, it takes a moment for that hot water to get into the tub, right? You might get cold water first. It's a pretty quick response time, but when it comes to the climate system, we're actually dealing with a 70 to 100-year lag time. So we're really only seeing the effects of carbon that was burned 70 years ago. So even if we stopped everything right now, we would continue to increase carbon in the atmosphere and in the oceans, thus heating the planet, thus causing a whole host of challenges for humanity. So we have really literally dug ourselves into a tough spot. I don't think that we have the time or the, I don't think we have the ability to just get stuck there. I think a lot of people get stuck in that point and just say, we can't do anything. I don't know what to do. This is overwhelming. And it is overwhelming. But one of the things that I've found after leaving the military and building a family within the environmental community and the anti-war community is that when you get your hands dirty, when you meet other people who care and you start doing work, there are things that you never imagined you could accomplish. And people are able to do it together. So this started with science. And what happened over the years is the scientists found ways to communicate to other people who are not scientists, who are better communicators. Because let's be honest, not everybody sitting in a lab or behind a computer desk should be on a television show or writing a book. And more people over the years began understanding the threats. In the middle 2000s, 2006, 7, 8, Al Gore released An Inconvenient Truth, which was probably up to that point the most public demonstration of what the challenges were. And then as we started seeing massive climate events hit the United States and hit other parts of the planet, the American population has changed. Now, we've been fighting against a very difficult enemy, and that is the fossil fuel industry. Fossil fuel industry, if they were sitting here right now, they would say all that they do is they provide us with the means for civilization. They give us oil and coal and gas.
They give us what we want.
They give us what we want. And I don't deny that for 200 odd years, that's what we've wanted. But it's much like cigarettes. And in fact, there's a very sinister connection with tobacco, with big tobacco, and with the climate denial industry. There are not many scientists in the world that are climatologists that are working on this issue that deny the science of climate change. There are not many. But I can bet you all of them have a straight phone line to ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and all of these industries. Because if you are a massive corporation and your profit motive or your profit comes from digging things out of the ground and burning them, and you're told that you can't do that anymore, well, that's not you can't take no for an answer. You exist because you're pulling things out of the ground.
And actually, one analogy I've seen is it's very much like the institution of slavery.
Yes.
The whole economy of this region was based on that, and to say no, they went to war.
So let's be clear, the struggle we're facing right now is a struggle about keeping fossil fuels in the ground.
So it's not just cutting back, it's keeping them in the ground.
It is keeping 80% of the existing fossil fuels in the ground. This will be the largest social shift in human history that we have to undergo if we're to have a civilization.
I think I've seen the estimate of reserves is something like $10 trillion. So someone's going to have to forego $10 trillion in profit.
Well, I would even argue on a deeper sense that it's not even profit to begin with. Because
they would say it's profit.
Yeah, they would say it's profit because they're able to separate like the money coming in from the actual damage that that money is doing. And I think it's really fascinating that you brought up slavery, and especially in the United States, because there are a lot of parallels. Of course, there are many, many differences, but there are a lot of parallels in terms of how much of the United States infrastructure was tied in with slavery. Certainly all of the South, but even more so, like many businesses throughout the North, directly profited from slavery. We are in a similar, and to have said in 1861, as the war is starting, the Civil War is starting, to have said, this is going to be relatively easy to extricate ourselves from this process and end slavery. I mean, clearly, again, evidenced by Black Lives Matter, we are clearly having massive issues moving through white supremacy as a culture and as a planet in a lot of ways. And as veterans, we see that with militarism and imperialism overseas as well. The old ways of behaving die hard. What we have to do is listen to. So let me tell you a story. Last year on January 8th, this is 2015, the Journal of Nature published a groundbreaking report. And this is one of the top journals on the planet. If you get published in this, you are a rock star in the science community. It is very rare. And the journal report it took a look at all of the carbon reserves So it looked at what Shell and BP and Exxon, what they have, what they own currently that's underground, that is not dug up or tapped yet. They also look at governments. What do governments own? What does the United States own? What is on national land or state land? And they came up with the 80%. They came to the conclusion that if we are to avoid drastic climate shift, we have to keep 80% in the ground. Well, why 80%? That sounds like a nice round number. We know that we cannot survive as human beings in a planet where the temperature has increased past 2 degrees Celsius. That has been agreed upon for many years. It is the centerpiece of global negotiations. Almost every country on the planet agrees on that number, and I would argue that it's actually lower. It's about 1.5, and as protesters in Paris last year said, it's 1.5 to stay alive. Those numbers are the keystone for what we're trying to do. We are trying to keep as much fossil fuels in the ground, and when it comes to all of the fossil fuel proposals in the Pacific Northwest, and in fact all over the United States, like, we have to stop them all. So right after that report comes out last year, Shell Oil Company makes a major announcement in Seattle that they're going to be starting Arctic drilling again. They had tried in 2012 and had a massive amount of mishaps. One of their drill rigs broke loose and smashed against Kodiak Island. They had a bunch of accidents. They didn't predict things very well, and they didn't plan very well. And the Obama administration basically temporarily stopped them from drilling. And here was Shell again, getting permission from the federal government and doing secret negotiations with the Port of Seattle.
I remember that.
And they got permission from the port, without any of the constituents in Seattle having a say in this, to be able to store the drilling fleet in Seattle and surrounding ports in Washington state before they would go up to the Arctic and drill in the Arctic in the summer. This kicked off a whole round of organizing. Groups as wide and far as Rising Tide, which is a radical environmental organization that has chapters all over the United States, in fact, all over the world, to Greenpeace, one of the oldest and most well-recognized climate activist groups, to 350.org, which is a more recent incarnation of online organizing that has become actually the progenitors of the action we're talking about today. And then smaller groups, more regional groups, such as the Mosquito Fleet, which is who I work with, or the Backbone Campaign, which is based off of Vashon Island. All these groups and many others, indigenous communities, Bayan, which is a group of Filipino activists that have a very direct relationship with climate shifts based on the Philippines. All these groups and more came together and began working on how do we stop Arctic drilling. We have the ships here in Washington state. We have a governor who was elected in Washington state to halt climate change, to help us address this, who's been very unsuccessful. We have a legislature with many people who've been elected to fight climate change. And yet here we are supporting Arctic drilling, not only one of the most dangerous places on the planet to drill, but also, as per that science report, that Nature report, we cannot do Arctic drilling and keep ourselves below 2 degrees Celsius. And these battles that ultimately became battles in some ways have been happening for a long time, but to get to the point that we're at right now, where folks are willing to get arrested, where folks are willing to put their futures on the line to address these challenges, it's been a long, long road. I mean, the environmental movement in this country has existed for over 100 years in many cases, but it really started out as a privileged white person,
right,
rich, I want to go hiking in the woods and drive my car up there. And we have moved drastically through that period. The environmental history of this country is not full of always great stories. There's a lot of things to be ashamed about. But we have learned from our mistakes, and we've gotten bigger and better, and we've tried to bring in more people, and we've tried to address things on a more systemic level. And in the last 15 years, we have voted, we have written petitions, and gotten people to sign them. We've had rallies. We've had marches, many, many marches. We've had global days of action with puppets and chalking and all kinds of very important educational tools. And we found that
all the things that people say you should do.
all the things that people say go out and do.
Democratic society.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it's the same parallel with my experience in the anti-war movement. We were told we have to educate and inform the American people. And we did that. We went out and we did that with the anti-war movement. We elected a Democratic Senate and House in 2006 and a Democratic President in 2008, all based on ending the wars. They didn't end. We elected people based on climate change. It wasn't addressed. And we're starting to see more and more that the mechanisms of Congress and of the corporate state that we live in are such that that relationship is so close of money and politics that we can't get the people elected by the status quo to change the status quo, that we have to do it ourselves. And so this is where direct action comes in. Direct action is looking at a problem and saying what needs to be done. Instead of stopping and asking permission or going back and trying to get all of the power brokers on the page, the house is burning. I need to go in the house and get my daughter out of the house. I don't need to worry about all the other things. I don't need to ask permission from the neighbors. Gonna save my daughter.
Right.
And that's where direct action as an analogy really comes in. So with Shell, the way that looked last year in Seattle was we had a whole bunch of levels of involvement. Some of it was again, parades and rallies and petitions, but coupled with that were demands saying, we don't want this in our city. We want the city council and the port commission to remove these people from our city. We want them banned. We don't want Shell doing Arctic drilling and associating with Washington State. And in order to do that, we're going to block this ship from leaving. We're going to block workers from attending, from going to work. Contract workers brought in from out of state, not even Washington State employees that Shell brought in. And as a side note, you often see these promises or this comparison between it's either jobs or the environment.
Yeah.
And that is a false dichotomy. It is completely false because it's either the environment, because that's us, that's our air that we breathe, and the food we eat, and the houses we do or don't safely live in, or the places we go to enjoy. It's either that or not that. That's the dichotomy. And so we have a choice to make about what are the new jobs of the future? What does a new world look like that doesn't focus on just digging things out of the ground and burning them? And in order to challenge that notion, we've begun having conversations about what we call a just transition. And a just transition is the process of asking, like, what kind of society do we want to live in? And we tried to start showing that as a movement last year in Seattle with Shell. So some of the most, you'll see some of the pictures here, but some of the best images came from these water-based actions, getting kayaks and indigenous canoes and fishing trawlers and sailboats out on the water to physically obstruct the path of one of the largest drilling rigs, the Polar Pioneer. I mean, this thing is a 400-foot behemoth built by the same Japanese company that built the Big Bertha that's stuck under Seattle. Gotta love it. They do a good job of building drill rigs. And the fight took on many different days. It wasn't just like one moment, right? So there were people that got arrested blocking the channel. I was one of the people that got pulled out by the Coast Guard on the day that the drilling rig was trying to leave. It was one of the saddest days in my life to feel like we had lost, to feel like all of this energy over months building and training and organizing and connecting with community members and everyone we met in Seattle and the surrounding areas. People were very supportive of it. They saw the David and Goliath battle for what it was. They saw the power relationship.
The pictures are really dramatic. I mean, just how many hundreds of kayaks were surrounding this rig.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, I think, again, to talk about the analogy between abolition movement and anti-slavery movement and the fossil fuel industry. Like, we were charged or communicated with, criticized, we should say, for using kayaks made of oil. And that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. Abolitionists wore cotton. Mm-hmm. Sometimes there are no other options, and you've got to fight with what you have.
And also, as what you're saying is, we want a change.
Yes.
Yes, we have kayaks made of plastic, but we want to move beyond that to something different, something that is sustainable.
Yes, and I think it's important to, again, focus on the fact that individual choice is not going to get us where we need to go. It's important that you take steps in your own life, but mostly for you, mostly for your own psyche, mostly for your own budget or your own health. That's the reason you should eat healthier. That's the reason you should drive less. That's the reason you should walk in the forest more. It's for your own health, and it sets an example. But when we're talking about addressing fossil fuel infrastructure, we're talking about systems of power. I can ride my bike for the rest of my life and never drive my car, and it will not make up for the next 5 seconds that Lockheed Martin is dropping bombs in Afghanistan or burning jet fuel.
Right.
These are systems that have to be addressed, and when those systems change, the people that are connected with them will change. And so what we're trying to say is that we want alternatives. We want a different way of living. And we don't believe that we have to just change our own personal selves. We want to transform society, and we want to transform society for the better of everyone. So what happened last year that really changed everything, there was this culmination of all kinds of different materials. There were majorly important books published. A number of movies came together at the right time. The evidence from the scientific community reached a crescendo that basically showed that we've reached this tipping point from a movement sense. It is now clear to the people of the United States and clear to the rest of the world that climate change is something that needs to be addressed. We are still working through the challenges of what that new world looks like. But what we do know is that fossil fuels have to stay in the ground. And if we keep them in the ground, the American people are ingenious. We have invented so many things. We will come up with alternatives, but we'll only come up with them when we're forced to, when there's incentives to do so. And right now, the incentive is to keep burning coal and oil and gas. And so our job is to really hold accountable those communities that, I wouldn't even call them communities, those industries that say, no, let's go as business as usual. Well, we're saying we can't have business as usual. And so some of the resistance that happened in Seattle spread. After the drilling rig left, it spread to Portland. And Shell had the HMS Fennica, which was a rented icebreaker that had a cap stack that they needed in case there was an accident. And they couldn't drill in the Arctic without it. Well, due to Shell's own, shall we say, laissez-faire attitude, they ran that boat aground trying to get it to the Arctic. And they had to drive it back to Portland to get it fixed. And this provided a massive opportunity of intervention for us. So people throughout the community coalesced around Portland, and 13 climbers hung themselves off of a bridge, creating an obstruction that bought time for more and more community members to join in. And when the city of Portland saw that this was happening in their backyard, they showed up. They showed up because they were given a choice to participate in a story that was bigger than themselves. And that's what we failed to do in social movements. That's what we failed to do as the United States of America, is give people a choice for a story that they want to be part of. We're constantly being pushed into stories that are fear-based.
So when you said the city of Portland showed up, you mean the people of Portland came out and supported
the people of
this
Portland
action?
showed up, and the mayor had to back down. The police, could have easily just raided us immediately, but they would have put people in danger, and the public pressure that existed made the power structure blink. So Shell wanted to get out of there, clearly, but the Coast Guard and the police and the other infrastructure in the city that generally would assist in this, they balked, they paused, they blinked. And in that 40-hour period that boat was shut down, we reached more people with this issue than any other time. So suddenly people are watching this battle between this massive icebreaker trying to leave and then getting stopped and turning around. And that feeling of, wow, we can do this. We can actually, if enough of us come together and stand together, they can't hurt us. If there's one person standing on the bridge, yeah, they can hurt that person. But if there's enough of us, they can't. So what's happening now is we're calling for global actions of direct action. We've had global parties, we've had global rallies, we've had global marches, and now we're having global direct action. And so on May 13th, 14th, and 15th of this year, a little over a month from now, we're asking people in the Pacific Northwest, from British Columbia and Idaho and Montana all the way down to Northern California and Oregon, to converge in Anacortes at March Point. March Point, as you'll see, has almost 50% of the total fossil fuels that we emit in Washington State run through and are processed at March Point. This is an infrastructure site that has to go away if we're going to have the world that I've been talking about. And so we are going to make a point about this location that has oil trains running through it, that ships chemicals all over the world, and that is processing fracking fluids, and has at times used coal. It is owned by Shell and Tesoro. There's 2 major plants there, and we are demanding that we transition away from fossil fuels, specifically at this location. These are going to be global actions. There's 5 actions in the United States. There's actions in far-flung places such as Australia and Nigeria. Indonesia is having actions. Germany, Canada, the UK. And these actions are based on obstructing inflows and outflows of fossil fuel. We want to stop it.
This worldwide action, that's BreakFree2016.org, right?
Yeah, so if you go to breakfree2016.org, you'll find all of the global actions. And what I really want for people in this region, in the Pacific Northwest, is to go to breakfreepnw.org.
That's this specific action.
That is the Pacific Northwest action. And there you can sign up. We've got questions that'll ask you if you're willing to risk civil disobedience, which means that there's a potential of arrest. And whether or not you are going to be on water or land. And then we'll contact you and we'll have a conversation about how to get you plugged in. So for example, one of the things that I'm doing in this is leading a lot of trainings around water-based action. So we're going to have as many boats as possible out in the water. This facility gets major oil tankers coming in every single day. And the town of Anacortes, I mean, is about 20,000 people, and they're threatened more than any of us are by this. I mean, the community that lives there is next to some of the most pristine and beautiful places in North America. The San Juan Islands are right there. The ferry terminal leads out. And growing up as a kid, I remember going on vacation to these places. I had to drive by this hideous Death Star-looking land destruction and that the March Point facility is, to be able to get to the vacation places, right? To get to the campground, you had to drive past this monstrosity. And so we are asking people to come out all 3 days, May 13th, 14th, and 15th. It's a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. We're asking folks to dedicate a 3-day weekend to this action. And if you've never been part of an action before, this is the time to start. If you've been doing this work but haven't been involved for 20 years because you got sick and tired and thought we were losing, this is the time to re-engage. This is the movement that is bringing many other issues to the table. We're trying to talk about poverty when we talk about climate. We're trying to talk about war. It involves veterans returning home. When we're dealing with climate justice and environmental justice, we're talking about poor and people of color communities that are directly threatened by all of this fossil fuel infrastructure. We are all in need of changing this system, and we want to be able to open this up to as many people as possible.
And the point is not so much that you're not going to shut this down on May 13th through 15th. The refinery will still be there, but this is a longer term process, getting people involved and making that message, putting that message out there clearly. It has to stop. These fuels must be left in the ground. We need an alternative.
Yes. So one of the points of direct action is to demonstrate that another world is possible. And that requires people paying attention. So sometimes, people have to, I've been part of many actions, for example, where traffic was stopped. And, many motorists get frustrated, like you're trying to get to work, you've got a time, that's understandable. And also, sometimes these issues are bigger than you getting to work on time. And that doesn't mean that we're going to be obstructing anybody's workflows. One of the things that we are in conversation with some of the workers at the plant about is understanding this isn't about them. That it is about their health, it's about their safety, but it's beyond them, it's beyond us, it's about a whole different world we're trying to build and a whole different style of living. We want a world where all of these workers don't have to go to a facility that kills its own workers when it explodes because of shoddy safety,
But
like
you're also
it did in
thinking that
2011.
they would go to some place where they can earn a living.
Yes, where they can earn a living and
Don't just shut
health
them
care
down.
and have a happier lifestyle and maybe work less in the week but still make the same amount of money. We want to move towards that scenario, and we are not intending to leave any of these people behind. So this direct action is going to be a show of force in some ways. We are going to try to grab the attention of the world and focus it on parts of their communities that are directly responsible for some of the worst health effects, some of the highest cancer rates, some of the largest emissions that are going into our atmosphere and oceans. And these people in these communities understand how important the biodiversity around them is. They understand it from a vacation standpoint. They make so much money on tourism. And if there's a major spill, or if one of these, if another plant explodes like Anacortes did a couple of years ago, they're losing their community members to this. It's not just outsiders claiming this. These are parts of our community. And growing up in Bellingham, Washington, I know that personally. So there are a lot of ways to plug into this. We need money. We need folks to show up with boats. We need people to show up with signs. We need food. There's all different kinds of ways that people can plug in. And I encourage you and others to go to breakfreepnw.org, because once you sign up, you'll be able to access all of those different, how to get there, when to get there. You can learn more about these issues, like what we've talked about tonight, and get an idea of how exactly you can bring that. But the bottom line is, we need everybody. If we're going to change this world, it's not going to come from leaders in Washington State or leaders in Washington, D.C.
We should have learned that.
Well, we should have, and you know what? I've got a tattoo on my arm that I got after the Army. And it was after I lost a really close friend of mine to suicide who had served overseas with me. And it serves as a reminder. And I use it to remind myself about not just war and how difficult it is to bring our community members home from those wars and end them, but also how scary it is to live in this moment of rapid change, of climate shifts, and with Trump politics, and everything seems to be so fear-based and so fast. And the tattoo, it says, "It's not too late. We have the rest of our lives." And I think that is the frame that we need to have. Yes, the odds are daunting. Yes, it's the fourth quarter of the football game and we're down by 2 touchdowns. But you don't quit. It's the playoffs. You keep fighting and you throw the kitchen sink at the wall and you hope it works. And guess what? Human history tells us again and again that it does work. When you're willing to believe, when you're willing to put your trust in other people and step forward into the unknown, to lean in, we've made it this far.
Yeah. If you think about one of the great unknowns in our history was fighting the British.
Yes.
I mean, how impossible was that?
It was ludicrous.
Yeah.
It was
So
ludicrous.
the change can actually happen. So 13th through the 15th is the current actions plan, but then from that, there'll be future actions continuing to make these demands.
This is an international storyline that's, for some people, I think they're starting to open the book halfway through and be like, this is an interesting story. But this has been going on for a long time, and it's only going to continue to escalate because we have no other choice. So, yes, through May, these global actions will continue to expand. We're going to see where we are at the end of May and see where we really need to put our energy into. But every day, more people are joining on. Every day, more people are getting educated and getting the skills that they need and figuring out the ways that they can plug in. We're building a larger community every moment that goes by. And the ultimate thing is that this is a race. Can we build that community? Can we create that alternative world before things are too late? And so the only thing I have to say about that is pick a side and get on. Let's get going.
Pick a side and go, and you have no choice, really. You have to go. If you fail, well, you're dead one way. If you succeed, you're not.
Yeah, and at least we had a little fun on the way out.
Yeah, I think about the training they had, our ambush training, which is you're supposed to turn and attack. The last thing you would think to do, but it's all you can do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in many respects, this has that same sense. We must do it.
React to ambush.
So, well, I appreciate you taking the time to come in and talk to us about that and the efforts that you're making. We're about to wrap up. Any last comments or thoughts?
Yeah, I think that, if you want to get involved in some water-based stuff, I encourage folks to come out to some of our kayak trainings. You can go to breakfreepnw.org and It'll list the kayak trainings. You can get involved, come donate a couple bucks, and we'll get you out on the water and show you how to maneuver a kayak around. And if you want to do some land-based stuff, like, you can sign up there as well. I think something I've just been thinking a lot about lately is this choice between love and fear, and how we all have that choice, right? Sometimes it doesn't feel like a choice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I remember after 9/11, it felt like there's no choice here. Like, there's fear, and that's it, right? I remember many times in the Army where I felt fear is the only option. But I gain a small amount of wisdom as I move forward, as I stumble forward into older age. And what that's started to teach me is that you always have a choice for love. And love is not passive. Love is not necessarily pacifist. Love is a very strong and powerful emotion. It includes loyalty. It includes community. It includes strength in numbers. And it means that when things are down for you, people are going to have your back. And ultimately, I think that's what we want. That's what we need more of. So I'm encouraging folks to not look at this from a place of fear. We have a great opportunity. And this is the most interesting time to ever be alive. So let's seize it.
Okay. Well, I wish you much luck, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
So Chapter 109 has identified climate change and the military contribution to that change as a major focus of our efforts. Our members are active in supporting a variety of efforts, such as BreakFree, to inform and spur people to take action to reduce and eliminate our dependence on fossil fuels. Supporting this work is an important part of our mission as Veterans for Peace and educating our community about the cost of war. Our mission is an enduring one. To quote Noam Chomsky, if you go to one demonstration and then go home, that's something. But the people in power can live with that. What they can't live with is sustained pressure that keeps building, and organizations that keep on doing things, and people that keep learning lessons from the last time and doing it better the next time. Thank you very much for watching.
Soldiers, speak out. We can tell the truth of what we've seen. We are not liars. Soldiers, speak out. We have a duty to all children and to their futures.